Yo, chilling here with the man Neo and myself. And I was just inspired to do this video, and it's likely going to be a bit longer of a one to really get into some, you could say, advanced topics on the path of enlightenment, of awakening. They are likely going to resonate for those that are really devotional on this path, have been quite serious about it, maybe for some time or just getting into it, but have had a certain sense of clarity or opening or awakenings that have occurred. It's a video that it's probably been brewing for a little bit of time now, and maybe for Neo too, who knows? And it'll kind of give an inside look into some questions that I do actually get often, especially in a time where it seems like there's a lot of turbulence, there's a lot of happenings in the world, there's things that are challenging, there's all these kind of mirrored elements in our collective perspective that are likely bringing up things individually for some of us. And so I get the question often, like, how am I experiencing, this astrological transit or this, challenge, or, just even the simple question of how are you is often something that comes up, in just normal conversations. And of course, there's a practical way of answering this, which I always tend to focus upon, because this is how we, relate with each other and how we connect in just a very simple human perspective. Though then there's also sometimes internal workings and perspectives that I kind of will tend to keep to myself, or more often now I've been sharing them a lot with those who do ask these questions. How you doing, Neo? This is his purple dinosaur that he takes everywhere. So, one of the core of these perspectives that I wanted to share is, in regards to the traditional definition of enlightenment or authentic awakening. Now, in the New Age circuit, let's say, this topic and this idea has many different definitions. But if we go into more of the authentic traditions of, say, advanced Buddhism or Jnana Yoga, or even getting into, maybe even more advanced systems like Kalantic science and Law of One, the advanced mechanics of Law of One teachings, we're getting into perspectives of enlightenment, which are very scientific based. They have very specific definitions and descriptions that aren't just up to this kind of woo-woo idea or perspective, or something that isn't really necessarily changing. Of course, we're on a planet where there's so many distortions and things, and I've gone into this at length because of the history, the very long history of this planet that gets into like Star Wars type of fantasies that we think are fantasies, but are actually very real elements to our ancient history. And so the distortions have made, all of these disconnections or varying perspectives of something that is actually very fundamental to the path of being a human. But there's also beauty in that, the differentiation of these perspectives, because this gives us, an infinite lens to the same thing. Though, on my path, there had been this kind of common theme of, as I was sharing recently about my journey, which went through many different phases of spiritual seeking, many different phases of, things I thought were enlightened practices, things I thought were bringing me to what I thought was enlightenment or an authentic awakening, and then being humbled yet again and again and again to deeper levels of, something which I thought I had already kind of attained. And so when we get into this kind of idea of enlightenment, from the traditional viewpoint, there's a kind of perspective that, yes, there is a final enlightenment, at least in this human body or being. And that final enlightenment is really when we realize that there is really nobody here to get enlightened. There's nothing here actually to get enlightened. We aren't anything in particular. The ego has just made all these ideas as to what we think we are and who we think we are and what we identify with and as. And so the realization of the absolute source of all is something that's inconceivable. It's not even an experience. It's like the experienceless experience. And this is something obviously hard to grasp in the mind. And of course, we define many of our awakening or enlightenment experiences as experiences. They are things in which we, come to witness, as witnessing the idea of our ability to witness our thoughts and feelings and sensations, or the ability for us to come into a perspective of the fact that we are this pure consciousness or pure energy, and we are not all the things in which we have thought ourselves to be or identified with ourselves to be, like this body or the things that happen within this body, and all the ideas and beliefs and opinions and identities that we come to know. We're not any of those things, and we are just this consciousness. That's, at least a certain layer of this enlightenment path. But we tend to find that, at least the authentic seekers at a certain point, and it was a stage in which I also went through, where we recognize that even this consciousness is still something we identify with. It's awareness or pure consciousness or pure energy becomes the new deity, the new God, the new guru, in a sense, that we are seeking out to become. But sure enough, as we continue to deepen along this path, something new starts to open up completely. And this has traditionally been quite rare, and it's been what some of the many great masters along the path of many thousands of years have talked about. But it's very rare that anyone actually comes to realize this because of the ego's traps and how strong the ego is, in like holding us in some perspective or in some idea, and not, being cracked open to the humility that it would require to realize that you are absolutely nothing and absolutely everything at the same time. And so I'm going to get into what that is and all what that looks like in a moment. But really, kind of what I'm painting a picture here is that our viewpoint of enlightenment, often gets construed with many other stages along the path. And one of the core kind of shifting zones of my journey, and for many who have been following the journey or have been following what I've shared and teachings and systems and tools that have supported me on the journey, likely have been aware of my work with Ramaji and Ananda and the Rasa transmission, and their work with the traditional David Hawkins level of consciousness system that Ramaji ended up redeveloping. And that system actually brings a quantifiable scale to consciousness and the layers and levels of consciousness and the layers and levels of enlightenment in particular, or awakening, which start in the 600 ranges, because it goes from 30 to 1,000, and it's a logarithmic base 10 scale. So it's an exponential scale of consciousness. So one person at 1,000 is balancing out like 10 million people at, say, the level of 200 or something like this. And so I went through the entire process with Ramaji, and it took almost a year, in around 2017. And that process and that journey really opened me up to a much more clear perspective of the process of awakening and the stages of awakening that occur, that many actually get caught up in, and they believe themselves to be enlightened or awakened or these types of things. Many prominent teachers are in some of these stages, at least according to Ramaji. And it's just a kind of signpost or a system that, opens up a new kind of logical, scientific, and we could say accountability type of scale that we can use to humble ourselves in a certain way. And one thing I'll mention about, my experience, I wrote a 40-page book that is still unreleased, that may be merged into my new book coming out, or I may just release it as a standalone, about my whole process through that journey. And because it was a very intense process, it was a very intense unfolding that kind of blew every possible idea that I had about enlightenment and awakening, and all of these kind of preconceived components that came from New Age circles, and a lot of times from people who weren't really enlightened or weren't really awakened, or what I thought or who I thought were, but may not have been necessarily. But then also reiterated many of the authentic teachings that I had come to over the years, and authentic teachings that really pointed to something that you could feel when they were sharing, that there was something there, but you couldn't really put your hand on it. It's like they're sharing around something, they're speaking around something, and they're pointing to something that you really can't actually hold with the mind. It's something that it's just so it's like the way I reflect on it now, and I teach this meditation, or I just offer it as a great tool, is just contemplating on what's beyond infinity. Like, can we meditate on the idea of what's beyond infinity? And this is something that where the mind just kind of shuts off. It's like it can't go there. It can't touch, it can't taste what that is. And that's actually what opens up many times this realization of this kind of emptiness that's also full, this nothingness that's also everything. And this is much of what was pointed to in the scale of consciousness with Ramaji, at 1000, the end of the road. And this is also what was shared by Buddha and many other teachers that had shared, that there was this end point that they feel they had reached, where there was a recognition. And I can share just how my experience is with this, but the recognition that there really isn't anything here. That's the best way that I've described it to people on my path of what my experience with this definition of enlightenment may be, or true awakening, or final awakening, final liberation, that people think is kind of leaving the body or dissolving into nothingness, or all these ideas, but is essentially just coming to recognize that all of the ideas or perceptions or observations that one may have identified on the path, be it beliefs and identities of this mind and body, or the essence of presence, the essence of energy, consciousness, pure awareness, all of these things are still identities or things we can kind of grasp a hold of. But in my experience of this kind of essence of, on the scale of consciousness at 1000, or what some people call final enlightenment, or all that, is really just this experience that there's really nothing here any longer. There's no seeker, there's no one that needs to get to some place. There's nothing, no one that can really grab a hold of anything. That's the way that I best describe it. And when that really occurred, it was kind of a very clear knowing that had happened in 2017, even before it was confirmed by my teacher at the time, Ramaji. And so, it kind of ignited a really interesting process, because at the time I was so identified with myself as a seeker. So when this kind of occurred, I very much wanted to demonstrate this and show this, and continue my teaching legacy now as this enlightened, awakened one, or something like this, And it really kind of came out like that. I was sharing a lot about it, and there was different things, and I went through my own humbling process with that. And there very much was said to be a post process that was to unfold, and this is talked about in Zen, and many other traditions, of a long integration period that isn't like there's someone there integrated. It's more the way I kind of best have seen it in my mind from another teacher that I learned from for years, was that it's like there's this knot being undone. And when the identity is kind of uprooted, and we see that there's nothing there anymore, it's kind of like now everything is just flying out. Everything that's being held, everything that needs to be cleared or cleaned up, is just kind of dissolving and unknotting itself on its own. There's nothing to even really do. And although I do still do many practices, and I deepen, and there's still an ever deepening unfolding, there's this really interesting, experience with that, because it's like, well, there's no more seeking, there's nothing to seek out, there's a knowing of what this is, and yet there's still all this like kind of never ending unfolding. And in my experience, it's almost like it's like years happening in days, and like every day is like years worth of realizations and insights and all of that. That's not this like ayahuasca journey or anything like that, but it certainly is experienced as this very broadening and opened journey that just kind of deepens and deepens and deepens. And that's kind of the illusion, I guess, with the final enlightenment idea, and how getting caught up in that even is just so silly. And that's what when I look at those initial months, 6 months or so after that process comparative to now, it's just so funny to see. Because one thing we have to understand is that there's different layers and dimensions of awakening. And I'm kind of really simplifying this, because in my journey right now, I've deepened a lot back into very advanced teachings of like halontic science and law of one, bioregenesis teachings, and getting into advanced light body mechanics and advanced systems of the anatomy and meditations and activations of things that even in the high levels of Tibetan Buddhism or advanced mystic schools of that we've seen on the planet still are not even at the levels of what much of this information has been able to explore or communicate. And so I'm coming into newer and deeper understandings of just the infinite nature of the unfolding. But it still doesn't change the fact that there is inwardly still this kind of empty place. There's nothing really there. It's like a mountain. It's like a rock solid mountain that even if my body is feeling weird or I'm tired or anger or sadness or emotions or things go, there's no one to hold to those things. There's no one to identify with those things. There's nothing really even there. So when these things arise, they pass very quickly. If it's some sort of spiral, it's not a spiral because I see it happening simultaneously and it just kind of fizzles out. So it's a very interesting thing to observe because it doesn't change anything really. I mean, there's still a human experience unfolding. There's still this ever deepening. There's still learning. There's still challenges of certain things, but at the same time, paradoxically, there isn't. Like everything kind of dissolves. So many of the issues that you may have faced or your character, all that, that's where the kind of human dimension of the awakening starts to really deepen. Because in this time we're in this phase where the feminine awakening is very much prominent, and we're seeing a lot more female spiritual teachers and female individuals who have these awakening experiences, and they're sharing a lot. And so they're sharing very much from their female body's perspective that is much more in tune with the layers of compassion and caring for nature and all beings, and understanding the human tantric element of the journey, where we've had predominantly male teachers being the ones who are the ones, at least the ones teaching. Maybe there's many other females who've been enlightened, of course, in the past, but mainly males teaching. And when they teach, a lot of times what's being taught is the vertical dimension of awakening. Again, this is oversimplified, especially when we look at something like advanced light body mechanics. There's so many dimensions and angles and all this that gets, very complex. But if we're just looking at it in the simple idea of the vertical dimension of awakening being the typical stages of enlightenment or the process of unfolding that one will go through to realize the absolute, which is, more of a common, it's not so common even in the non-dual scene, but in a lot of these more advanced male teachers, the absolute or realizing the absolute is certainly kind of the hot topic, because that is the final enlightenment, the enlightenment where this space of everything but nothing comes into fruition. And so with this kind of vertical trajectory of coming to realize the nature of God source within, but beyond God source, because it's beyond any true name, this is very much what the male teachers are presenting. So when we come to recognize that the realization of the absolute, hello Neo, joining us, is, and he's actually been a great teacher for the horizontal dimension, which I'm going to get into. So it's a good segue. But the vertical dimension of the masculine form of teaching to realize the absolute, become enlightened, and kind of come to the end of the road is kind of just like one element or one angle to what's really being spoken here. And as I was mentioning, in my deepening of understanding things like halontic science and law of one teachings, which are basically like the teachings of the universe and have in a sense been webbed into every teaching on the planet, because they're all based on these original teachings. But these original teachings have been not on the planet or hidden away for a very long time. So as they come through, they're kind of rewiring, at least certainly in my brain, and rewiring the consciousness of these advanced teachings that many enlightened beings have generally looked at. And those are traditionally the teachings of mystic Christianity, the teachings of high-level yana yoga or Kriya-based yoga, or various other yogas, but the more advanced section of the traditional yogic system, and then the advanced forms of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Daojian Buddhism, and I mean, all the paths of Buddhism are supportive, but some of those, when we think of advanced, Tibetan monk in the cave, these are the typical Tibetan Buddhist paths that we're thinking about. So these paths and these forms of teachings generally are presented in a way that is very vertical based, and it is very focused on, the realization of those vertical dimensions of self, where, as Buddha would say, or many other teachers, that there was certainly an end of the road. And this is also reiterated with, Ramaji's work with the level of consciousness and these other varying systems. So with these systems in mind, we're recognizing a very masculine kind of logical viewpoint on what the path looks like. Yet, when we think about the feminine teachings, or we could say now the horizontal dimension, this is what's more popular now in the New Age about embodiment, coming into an embodied compassion, let's say, or rewiring our morality. What are our true ethics? Are we acting with compassion and love and respect for all beings, or are we still an asshole? Are we still, are not following the traditional precepts that laid the foundation for a lot of these ancient spiritual traditions? So obviously, when the common mind thinks of spirituality, they think that, well, if someone's enlightened, they must be just the most loving and, most beautiful and respectful person. But although this is common, because, oftentimes over the course of time after an enlightenment, a true enlightenment or awakening, there will be a deepening into the compassion. There will be an embodiment. There will be an over time clearing and resolving of traumas and perspectives that may have skewed that being's way of acting and experiencing in the human dimension and the relationships and their day-to-day life. So that's common, but it's not always the case. There have been, many enlightened beings that, few in if we put it into perspective, but there have been certainly some that were still not the nicest of people, or even what someone would call evil in some sense. Genghis Khan is a good example. I've talked about that often. And there's numerous texts that speak of his kind of final enlightenment that he embodied, but certainly not the most nicest of fellows. He's like a Hitler of sorts, right? So these are interesting perspectives, of course, and they make things a little bit less generalized and a lot more detailed, because we have this vertical dimension of experience that can result as the final enlightenment at a certain point, which, again, I'm going to really get into this final enlightenment topic, as I already have, but the element of final enlightenment does not necessarily mean the end of the road, but it does certainly mean that there is, in the traditional definition of enlightenment, an end point, a realization that we are this infinity. Every moment and everything is infinite, and infinite in all ways, all dimensions, all experiences. Every specific manifestation of life, of consciousness, of God's source, is whole and complete in and of itself, and there is no separation between an observer and something that is observed. There's no separation of dimensions and times and experiences and people, places, things, thoughts, feelings, sensations. Everything is just the same one absolute source. And so that's what is then resulted as this kind of, at least what I was sharing about, my personal experience, where there's still human dimensions and things that occur, but everything just feels pretty much the same. Everything is observed in the same way, because the identity that's being held behind or within anything in particular is not there. So it's a really interesting experience, but yet then there's still the deepening, and that's what has been so interesting that I love talking about now. And it's funny, I'm doing this video that is going back into traditional non-dual topics, and speaking about the rasa transmission again for the first time in quite a long time, at least in, for me, a day is a long time these days, but yeah. So speaking about this now at a time where much of my teachings are more embodiment focused, much more about feeling into emotions and purifying, the traumas that we have, or the cleansing of the body, the coming into a place of compassion within all of life. And this is naturally, obviously, an expression of my own journey and what I've been through over this past 3 years or so now, where much of my journey has been a humbling into compassion, a humbling into what does it mean to live the human experience in a much more grounded and humble and patient, respectful way. And so speaking of this now is just at a time where much of it is all kind of coming full circle, because my perspective with the path is that although my path took a certain route and trajectory, for each being it's going to be very different. For each being it's not all going to be the same path, of course, and most of us know this, but this can get very nuanced, and there can be varying verticals that one is focusing on at a certain time, or horizontals, I guess, as I was saying, that are unique to the timeline of your own path and your own journey. And this is what the feminine perspective is kind of bringing, right? Is that just racing to the top to realize, the enlightenment is not always the way for everyone. In a certain light, I would view that to be the fundamental foundation on a certain perspective. And then on another, we could say that having compassion and true empathy and true ethics and morality is also equally as important, especially within a human experience and the human dimension. So this is just like, it's such a beautiful topic overall, because it kind of really grounds in this kind of mystical idea we have about enlightenment. And that's what I loved about working with the level of consciousness system, and then coming into Kaolonic science as well, because KS, for instance, doesn't have any gurus or teachers or masters or whatever. Of course, there's people that teach or at least guide within it, or mentor, or give their perspectives. And I mean, of course, the Kaolonic science system is just, the community is filled with its own drama as a whole as well. But at least that drama is actually showing the human dimension, of the nature of the experience, and how it doesn't matter how advanced someone is or something is or some teaching, there is still the commonality of us all being in a human body, of us all being in this human dimension, which equalizes everything. So it's it kind of wraps everything together in this kind of infinite spiral of we realize we are infinity, and then we experience infinity. That's really what it is. And that's very much of what the question had always been on my path was, okay, well, what is after enlightenment? Like that was really what my questioning was coming into, especially around 2016 or so. Like, what is after enlightenment? My perspective of enlightenment was this end of the road. You dissolve into nothingness, or you're just out of the body and you're gone, or all these things. But then I started hearing perspectives like, for instance, firstly, just grounding into the questioning of a lot of the mythology in a lot of the traditions. Is this mythology, what is this mythology really speaking to? Who are these gods? Who are these beings that have come? What are these stories really pointing to? I didn't want any longer the childish like stories. I wanted the real thing. And that's what naturally brought me back into Kaolonic science and Law of One teachings, which give a much more broadened perspective on the true history of this planet, for one. In Voyagers 2, that book is, such an expansive book that I still haven't really gone through the whole thing. There's just so many pieces to it. And then all of the different workshops and things that came in during that period of those transmissions coming in, and bringing a way more advanced and adult look at and answering that question, what is beyond enlightenment? The idea of our traditional viewpoint of enlightenment maybe is not even close to what is the final, unfolding. And that's where, it gets into a real gray area in my perspective, that there's this simultaneity. There can be this kind of feeling of this end point, or this realization that we are made of all the same source, and there is this knowing of that, and yet there's still this perpetual game being played, this unfolding, this eternity, this endless process of realization that brings such a grounded humility to the eternal nature of co-creation, that we are endlessly going into all dimensions, all planets, all star systems, different bodies and ways of being on this planet and other places. It really just brings us into direct contact of what infinity and eternity actually is. And that, I feel, is not so much a discussion within traditional enlightenment circles because of the predominant focus on this end absolute realization, this end, knowing of all. And although that is such a beautiful thing to focus upon, and it is really for some, and if you're at that stage, the only thing to be focused on, really, without maybe negating your human experience, or responsibilities, but sometimes even that is to be left behind. But it's fun. Paradoxically, it's funny that as we come to know that, or as we come to, to this end point of enlightenment or what have you, it's going to bring us back into the circle of the human experience and the eternal unfolding, and this kind of endless nature of the cycles of what we're here for in this destined life, and what we've done before and what we're going to do, in this body or another. And so, it's such a vast topic, really, and I'm really just touching the surface in this fairly lengthy video. I just felt called and inspired to share this because the clarity is there. And so much of my work now, in development, especially right now, I'm developing a bunch of core verticals on all the facets of the awakening path, not only the non-dual meditations and self-inquiry, or if someone wants to go down the transmission route, or deepen in fasting and relationships and sex and tantra, getting into the dimensions of how we're being of service. These are all important forms, and that's why yoga, for instance, had all of these dimensions covered. All traditions have had many of these dimensions covered, because a combination of different ones will support in different things. And although we can say that, in yoga, the king of yogas is traditional Advaita, non-dual jnana, self-inquiry, or jnana yoga, um, that's still very much that kind of masculine way of looking at things, which is certainly valid. Though when we take the other side into account, we have this paradoxical, simultaneous kind of viewpoint on things that is quite beautiful, and very deeply fulfilling. I could say that, coming to that end point on what I thought was the end at a certain point in my journey, there was such a beauty to it, and yet at the same time there was still clearly this unfolding and work and integration to unfold, which is still ongoing, and it will still continue. But sharing from where I'm at now is an interesting lens into what I at least experience each day, and likely what some of you have begun to taste or come into, or maybe are experiencing directly. But one thing that's important is that we have to be very humble with ourselves on the journey, and that's something that has probably been one of the biggest lessons over the past few years, is just the ongoing humility to continue to recognize the unfolding of the work that is to be done. It's not necessarily work that we have to do, it's to be done, meaning it's going to just simply occur. And that's really the viewpoint of the simplistic viewpoint of what an enlightenment or a true awakening would really be, is that everything is simply happening, and everything is simply God's source. Everything is simply the same source of what makes up all things and all life. So if everything is that, and everything is this, and everything is happening in the same way, then, well, we can just rest within it all. That's the real beauty. So, yeah. Now, awakening on the vertical dimension, or the vertical layer, it kind of destroys all the ideas and beliefs that we may have come to know, as I was explaining, in regards to morality, in regards to being a good person or being compassionate, all that, or even getting into things like diet and fasting, energy healing, and all of that. Like, these elements may not necessarily be required. One needs to be vegan, or be fasted, or be healed and cleansed on the physical body. These things are not necessarily required for that enlightenment to occur. Now, hello, Neo. Now, enjoying the bliss of a puppy, or the bliss of a physical body that, is more healed or more deepened, that may be an aspect of the journey. I know it has been for mine. And that's kind of just a practice of the karma, the tendencies, the past lives, the things that you may have involved in before, or continue to enjoy, just simply enjoy. If you enjoy eating light and fasting and experiencing that dimension, doing lots of breath work, being in nature, it's natural that we would, because these are reflections of ourselves. But we may also enjoy eating a big meal. We may also enjoy, just hanging around watching Netflix, or doing all kinds of other things. And from a perspective of what the point of what in true enlightenment is revealing, these elements are not dependent. Enlightenment is not dependent on these components being all lined up. That's the beauty of the imperfection of the human experience. It's not, nothing is perfect, because there's no real absolute ideal. That is all just a product of belief structures and ideas, and of course there's fundamentals on science and factual aspects of our path, but in a certain sense it is all never endingly like changing. It's all unfolding and expressing in many different ways from many different viewpoints and perspectives. So this kind of grounds us in, and often those tools and aspects of our belief structures on the path, like I've alluded to before, like the cape of spirituality, the crystal packets and the shaman and all the things that we've come to know about what we view to be, our spiritual attire, our spiritual beliefs, our spiritual perspectives. Those will all have to go out the window, really, to realize the nature of what it means to be clear of the mind, clear of the false identity, and that aspect of self in which very much takes ownership of these spiritual beliefs and ideas and perspectives that may not necessarily be of service at certain stages of the path. And then, like I mentioned, as that vertical realization occurs, then sometimes the deepening back into things that we may have not delved into before, or potentially, for one who never endeavored into fasting or relationship healing or trauma work or things like this, that may then be revealed, because there's such a non-linear a non-linear viewpoint to this path, that at the same time has very many specific linear steps. But as the masculine essence has been merged into the feminine, and that complete full spectrum awakening becomes more and more accessible, and a intention of us all, then many of these rules start to shift, and we start to get a whole picture of what both linear and non-linear perspectives can reveal. So yeah, this is a nice piece, and an important one that I feel as we continue to contemplate, we gain more and more insights into. But yeah, so I mean, it's all fun. It's all endless exploration, and people will take this as they want to take it. I mean, it's not really a video to tell people I'm enlightened, but it's just a video to share the experience, because I feel like that's actually part of it. I mean, firstly, many of the beings that I've learned from who were certainly enlightened, were very adamant and vocal about the fact that that was the case. Most people think that, an enlightened being would never say that they're enlightened and things like that. Um, and but it's not really about that anymore. It's not about this idea of enlightenment or not enlightenment. It's because it's so eternal and it's so infinite, and we're so humbled by that fact. Um, then that has no real meaning, to say I'm enlightened or this or that, because it's the most obvious and simple thing you could ever imagine. It's your very nature. It's the very essence of who and what you are. Um, so that's important, and it's a funny thing to even explore. But at the same time, there is certainly a knowing of it when it happens and when it occurs. There's a knowing of a clarity that emerges, and depending on where one's at on the path, that may be completely irrelevant. From a more feminine perspective, it's kind of an elusive idea, this enlightenment, to be enlightened. It's an elusive idea, because the moment that that's claimed, it just continues to unfold. So it's just a funny thing. But it's useful for us to have sharings of the unfolding and the path and all of that, mainly because it has to be grounded. It can't just be, this one person says it's this and this is what it is, and then we're all just trying to decipher it, or we think that, maybe we're not even worthy of it. That's a part of the core thing, because most people get really, irritated. Oh, someone's calling themselves awakened or enlightened. there's a projection of an intense kind of pushback, but the reality is, really, it's the ego within that's projecting its own pains and its own limiting beliefs of, well, I can't possibly be enlightened. How could I ever be truly awakened or enlightened to myself or to the true nature of all? I'm not worthy of that. That's a lot of what ends up coming up, and that's one of the core elements of why enlightenment or awakening just doesn't happen for a lot of people, for the majority of those on the planet, and then even the majority of those on the seeking path will have, in the past at least, not come to realize the nature of who they are. So it's important that it's constantly reiterated that it is possible for the most common of individual. I'm not anyone special, and like I said, I'm not really even claiming anything in particular. I'm just sharing my experience and how it matches up to the descriptions, the qualitative descriptions of what the enlightenment states have actually been, and how they've been described by the great masters that we look to, and recognizing that oftentimes now those masters are amongst us. Those other beings and those people that we've looked to as great gurus, teachers, masters, spiritual teachers, all that, maybe they're just amongst us. Maybe now we're coming to recognize that they're simply just all around us, and maybe even we are that as well. And so if we can come to see this for ourselves, then, well, there's nothing really better than that, because it's only ever going to be our own experience that's going to be able to tell the tale. So this is it. This close-up now. And I want to show you Neo, but he's not there. I feel that's all for now, and we'll see where this unfolds. ayp.life is where I'm sharing a lot of things, and all the social channels and all those vertical kind of course components are all, a lot of them are ready. A lot of them I'm doing one-on-one, so you can connect with me. I got a lot of other resources too, of many other great teachers that I can share. So this is all. Deep love.